I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. My life has value.
Hi there, my name is Mark Fairley for the Fuel Project, and this is the first in the video series, Know Your Enemy. The purpose of this video series is to explore the formation of the One World Order from a biblical perspective, where it's come from, who's behind it, and where it's going in the future. Now, we're going to be covering a lot of ground over the coming months, and this is just a short introductory video to give you an idea of the kind of topics that we're going to be looking at. I also invite you to get involved on the Facebook page, which is www.facebook.com/thefuelproject.
How I landed, I don't quite remember. I fell to pieces one night in December. Pictures and boxes remind me of something. I miss the days when our fingers were touching. The memories of losing you, you're like a ghost, chasing what I said to you. I wish you were listening, I wish you were listening, I wish you were listening to get through it. I wish you would listen. I wish you would listen. I wish you would listen. To get through it, to get through it. All my decisions were just second guesses, looking for love like a bride looks for dresses. Every mistake turned to some sort of yearning. A heart that was hollow has filled up with meaning. The memories of losing.
Effect of CO2. Evidence shows that human activity contributes to global warming by adding to and changing the levels of the gases responsible for the
I wish you would listen. I wish you would listen. To get through it. I wish you would listen. I wish you would listen. I wish you would listen. To get through it. To get through it. I wish you would listen. I wish you would listen. I wish you would listen. To get through it.
Our enemy, as you no doubt will know, is Satan. Our study therefore can't start anywhere else. He is the dark being known as the father of lies, rebellion, disobedience, and chaos. He is the source of all evil, but this was not always the case. In Isaiah 14, we are informed that Satan was once a radiant archangel called Lucifer. In its Latin root, the word Lucifer means the one who brings light, and in Hebrew it means the morning star. In 2 Corinthians 11:4, we are told that even today Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. This is an important point to kick off with, as we tend to think that if we saw Satan, he would have an obviously evil appearance and would be easily recognizable. When you hear the name, you're probably picturing a demonic figure with red skin, a trident, horns, and tail. The truth is that if we saw Satan, he would have at the very least a neutral appearance, and if we can go a stage further, it is far more likely he would even appear strangely attractive to human eyes. There is further evidence for this when we consider that in the last days, when the Antichrist appears on the world stage, the Bible suggests he will have a handsome appearance that will be part of the charm that draws people to him. His physical appearance will be part of his deception. In Ezekiel 28:12-13, we get an insight into the physical beauty that Lucifer possessed. You were the model of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering: the sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx and jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald with gold. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. The Hebrew meaning of timbrels and pipes is not certain, but it is widely accepted by biblical scholars that Lucifer was probably responsible for orchestrating the worship of heaven, and hence this apparent reference to musical instruments. He was a musical genius. Later, we will discover that he continues to use his skill in this area as a means of captivating people to this day. It was Satan's beauty that caused him to fall to pride. We are told that at some point he became so taken with his own glory that he sought to make himself equal with God and turned in rebellion against his Creator. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, on the utmost heights of the sacred mountain. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. It is sometimes easy to fall into the trap of thinking that Satan is some kind of equal but opposite force to God. Certainly, he would like to portray himself in this way, and equality with God is his ambition. But in fact, as a created being, he is at the very most on a level with the archangels. Scripture suggests that when Lucifer rebelled and fell from heaven, he undermined the loyalty of 1/3 of God's angels, and they fell with him. We call these fallen angels demons, and they make up Satan's spiritual army around the world. How did he manage to persuade some angels to follow him? Ezekiel 28 gives the answer. You are the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of the fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you. By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. Therefore I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. He won them round by the abundance of his trading. This is often mistranslated as something to do with commercial activity, buying and selling. The word trading actually comes from the Hebrew that means to go up and down as a talebearer or secret agitator. Today we call it campaigning or lobbying. That is how Lucifer alienated the loyalty of the angels, by going back and forth amongst them, whispering in their ears and sowing seeds of disaffection. He portrayed God as a tyrant and offered the angels a higher place in his kingdom if they agreed to join him in rebellion. This same word trading is used in other parts of the Bible, and it gives us further insight into his methods. In Leviticus 19:16 we read, You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people. This verse describes a slanderer, a person who brings false accusations and insinuations. Lucifer falsely accused God of being a despot, a tyrant who cared only for his own grandeur and glory, with no appreciation of these angels who were faithfully serving him. In Proverbs 20:19, there is another instance of the same word. He who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets. Therefore do not associate with the one who flatters with his lips. This verse closely associates talebearing with flattery. Lucifer used flattery amongst the angels in order to convert them to his cause. In Jeremiah 6:28 and Ezekiel 22:9, the word is translated as slanderer. He slandered God's name. It is the same Hebrew word, a person who goes to and fro, sowing disaffection and disloyalty by using flattery and misrepresenting authority. So God cast Satan out of heaven along with 1/3 of the angels. Where are they now? Another misconception here is that he now resides in hell. The Bible makes it clear that he is not yet there and that he is still operating here on earth. Satan is currently the ruler with authority in the region of the air. Now there are two Greek words for air. One of them gives us the English word ether, and the other gives us the English word air. Ether is the higher, rarer atmosphere. Air, AER, is the lower atmosphere contiguous with the Earth's surface. Satan operates in the air, the AER. He is the ruler of the realm of authority contiguous with the surface of the Earth. Ephesians states that from this position he is the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. Satan is at work in all those who are disobedient to God. We have only two options in this life. We can either be in God's territory or in Satan's territory. There is no third option. If we are submitted to God's appointed ruler, Jesus, we have the right to be in God's kingdom. If we have rejected or not accepted Jesus, we are in Satan's kingdom because we are sons of disobedience. Satan has legitimate authority over all those who are in rebellion against God. He rules over rebels. That brings us to his influence with human beings. Since pride had been the root of Lucifer's rebellion, God's response was to make a different kind of creature, Adam or man. Man was made from the dust of the earth, but also in God's image. Therefore, the lowest and the highest things were combined in him. The fallen Lucifer, now renamed Satan, had particular enmity against man for several reasons, but I just want to highlight a couple of them. Firstly, man visibly represented God to the rest of creation. He was made in God's image. Satan could not touch God himself, but he could make war against the very image of God within man. He delights in defiling that image, destroying it, humiliating it, and to that end he works tirelessly. A second reason is that man was destined to take Satan's place of dominion, and so from the moment of his creation, Satan saw him as a rival whom he needed to eliminate. Satan procured man's downfall through the same motivation that caused his own, the same motivation that he gave to the angels who fell with him and became his army of demons. The process is described in Genesis 3. In the form of the serpent, Satan came into the garden where God had placed Adam and Eve and tempted them into disobedience and rebellion. This is the record of that temptation and downfall. The serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild animals the Lord God had made. One day he asked the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat the fruit from any of the trees in the garden?" "Of course we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden," the woman replied. "It's only the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden that we are not allowed to eat. God said you must not eat it or even touch it. If you do, you will die." "You won't die," the serpent replied to the woman. "God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil." The woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. At that moment their eyes were opened, and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. Satan offered them equality with God, but notice how he promised it to them. He said Godhood could be attained through knowledge. It's incredibly important we notice that. In effect, he was saying, once you have knowledge, you won't need to depend on God any longer. Once you know what he knows, you'll be equal with him. This position of subjection and dependence that you're in isn't worthy of you. You're capable of a higher destiny. Reach up and reach out for knowledge that will set you free from the slavish dependence on your Creator. Become a God yourself. This flattery and deception caused man to fall. That which caused Satan's own fall, that which caused a third of the angels to fall, also caused man to fall. From this we should gather that this lie is powerful. The trading, the tale-bearing, the flattery, the slander actually works. As we'll discover, it's still bringing people down to this day. We should also gather from this that Satan has no new tricks, but that he doesn't need any. The old tricks keep working against those who don't have the knowledge of the truth to discern against the deception. Ezekiel 28 also gives us a picture of how Satan operates, and it's important we grasp this as it will underpin everything that follows. Ezekiel 28 is divided into two sections, each a lamentation or a pronouncement of woe. The first section centers on the prince of Tyre. The second is about the king of Tyre. On close inspection, we find that the prince of Tyre was a human being. It is clearly stated that he was a man, even though he claimed to be a god. On the other hand, it is equally obvious that the king of Tyre was no human being. His description is clearly that of Satan. And there's the insight. We have a human ruler, the prince of Tyre, and behind him in the unseen realm, we have the satanic ruler, the king of Tyre. The human ruler is not much more than a puppet who performs as the strings from the unseen realm dictate his moves. When you apply this idea to human history, the idea that there are spiritual beings behind the physical rulers and that the spiritual world actually dictates the physical world, history and politics take on a very different meaning. As we examine many of the so-called great and infamous men of history, we begin to see evidence of the strings that guided their movements. The Bible says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." In other words, our war is not with the princes of Tyre, the human beings, it is with the king of Tyre, the demonic rulers of the air. We are in a war against a very powerful and highly organized spiritual kingdom, which has rulers, sub-rulers, and sub-sub-rulers. Each ruler is responsible to Satan for a certain area under his authority. Satan has the whole world divided up into areas that he seeks to dominate through these demonic rulers. Nevertheless, there have been, are, and will be powerful human princes in this world that we should be aware of. These are merely puppets of Satan who deliberately and effectively work towards his ends. In 1 John 2:18 we read, "You have heard that the Antichrist is coming. Even now many Antichrists have come." This is a reference to occultists who, knowingly or otherwise, further Satan's agenda on the earth. We will discover more about them later. Finally, what is the end goal for Satan? Well, quite simply, he is steadily and consistently pursuing world domination. One place we see this clearly is in reference to the end times. As I understand prophecy pertaining to this time, there will be a very short period right at the end of the age when Satan will temporarily succeed in having the whole world under his spell. He will do so through a certain man whom he will raise up called the Antichrist, who will be empowered by Satan. Satan will persuade much of the world to worship this Antichrist, and in doing so they will actually be worshipping Satan himself, just as worship of Jesus Christ is worship of God the Father. Why does Satan want above all things to be worshipped by the world? Again, because he wants equality with God. Worship is the one activity that belongs by right to God himself. If Satan can receive worship from mankind, it affirms his claim for equality. When we become truly aware of the conflict of kingdoms, we find that Satan's supreme ambition is to be worshipped. It is also important to realize that what we worship is what has power over us. Now that we have been given a cursory introduction to our adversary, we need to whisk ourselves back through the midst of time to the very beginning of all history, to the Garden of Eden, the place where it all begins. First of all, you may notice that the story of creation, the fall of man, and indeed the whole of Genesis is probably the most contentious book of the Bible, the one that is attacked most regularly and with the most venom. This is because Genesis, particularly chapters 1 to 11, is the foundation upon which the rest of the Bible is built. The creation story, the fall of man, Satan's role in it, and how the nations were birthed are fundamental to our understanding of the world we live in. This is why it is so unpopular with that fallen world. If it can be undermined or disproved in any way, the rest of the Bible would be discredited, just as a building would collapse without its secure foundation. However, what happened in the Garden of Eden has a very real impact in the world today. After Adam and Eve were tempted by Satan's offer to become as gods through secret knowledge, sin entered into the world, which became cursed with death. God pronounced several judgments on all concerned, curses that would affect all their descendants for the rest of time. He says to the serpent, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." This is the first of hundreds of Old Testament prophecies that refer to Jesus Christ. God had already set in place a plan of redemption whereby the offspring of a human woman would crush the serpent's head but would be bruised in the process. Adam and Eve went on to have two sons called Cain and Abel. Cain killed his younger brother in a fit of jealousy and was thereafter banished from the Garden of Eden by God. The Garden of Eden, incidentally, is described by Scripture to have been located in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which would place it in the area we now refer to as Iraq. After his expulsion, Cain is noted to have set about becoming a builder of cities and is thereafter always associated with the evil one. The rebellion of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden marked the start of a severe decline into depravity and perversion for the world. The descent into wickedness was so severe that it reached a point where God saw that everything human beings thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. This was also around the time where we find out about the strange creatures known as Nephilim. The Bible explains. In those days, and for some time after, giant Nephilites lived on the earth, for whenever the sons of God had intercourse with women, they gave birth to children who became the heroes and famous warriors of ancient times. Things were clearly going very wrong, and God was sorry he ever made mankind. He decided to wipe everything off the face of the earth and start again with a man called Noah. This led to one of the most famous biblical events, where a great flood covered the whole earth and destroyed everything except that which was safe in the ark. Now, after the great flood in Genesis, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham had a son called Cush, and through the family line of Cush there came a man called Nimrod. The Bible reports it like this. The descendants of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The descendants of Cush were Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabtika. The descendants of Rama were Sheba and Dedan. Cush was also the ancestor of Nimrod, who was the first heroic warrior on earth. Since he was the greatest hunter in the world, his name became proverbial. People would say, "This man is like Nimrod, the greatest hunter in the world." He built his kingdom in the land of Babylonia with the cities of Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. From there he expanded his territory to Assyria, building the cities of Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calneh, and Resen, the great city located between Nineveh and Calah. I include verses 6 and 7 in this reference because it's important to note the extra attention given to Nimrod in comparison with the other descendants of Ham. Even so, this only hints at his importance in the history of mankind. He was possibly the first king in world history. This is the first time the word kingdom is mentioned in the Bible. He was master and commander of a vast empire, the first man of renown, the first heroic warrior on earth. But when the Bible reports that Nimrod is the first mighty man in history, a fierce warrior and a great hunter, we should avoid being tempted into thinking highly of him, because the Hebrew root of the word for mighty man actually translates into English as tyrant. The Jewish Talmud calls him a hunter of the souls of men, and the famous Jewish historian Josephus also talks of Nimrod as a tyrant or dictator. Indeed, his name, Nimrod, literally means "let us revolt" or "the rebel." And unlike the other descendants of Ham, who mostly ended up in Africa or China, Nimrod, who it was believed was born in modern-day Ethiopia, headed towards the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. That's right, the exact spot where the Garden of Eden had been. The fact he was returning to the scene of the original fall of man to build his empire is significant in itself. He clearly meant something symbolic by it. Perhaps he was identifying with that scene of original rebellion. Perhaps he was metaphorically trying to build a new Eden by his own power and apart from God. Perhaps he was identifying with Cain by stubbornly returning to the spot that Cain had been expelled from. Perhaps it was all of these reasons, but it was here that he built the city of Babylon. He also built the city of Nineveh nearby and conquered the others that already existed in the area, thus creating his empire. As the first to learn the arts of war, Nimrod ruled and subdued his empire with an iron fist and was noted for his use of sorcery and fire to gain his victories. Like many men of renown in the ancient world, myths and legends arose around him to the extent that it's now impossible to discern which are true and which are not. You may recall a scene from Braveheart where the Scots are about to go into battle with the English, and many, upon seeing William Wallace for the first time, refuse to believe it is the man they have heard so much about. In the legends that have arisen around him, he is 10 feet tall and can shoot fire from his behind. This is the kind of thing that surrounds the legends of Nimrod. What we can discern, however, is that he was strongly associated with fire and that he used it in battle to strike fear into his enemies. This created an association with himself and the sun. Fire was seen to be the sun's earthly representation. We also know that he was sometimes represented as a bull and that he probably wore a crown made from bull horns. The reason for this is that the Chaldean or Babylonian word for ruler was Tur, which also meant bull. Finally, we should notice how closely the description of Nimrod matches that of the hybrid Nephilim. The words heroes, famous, and warriors are used of both, and some commentators have suggested that he was of this type. Certainly, these giant beings were a result of a demonic invasion of humanity and led to complete moral degradation, something that Nimrod should be associated with, as we will soon discover. The city that Nimrod built was Babylon. Now, the name Babylon occurs in the Bible around 354 times, mostly in the Old Testament, and is in fact second in importance only to Jerusalem throughout Scripture. Biblically, it is always viewed as the devil's city, while Jerusalem is viewed as God's city. They are regularly contrasted with one another and seen in opposition to one another, so we need to understand more about it. By all accounts, Nimrod's Babylon was the first great city of the world, which in turn was the capital of the first great empire of the world. In fact, we have reason to believe that Babylon was the greatest empire of all time. The Babylonian Empire had two eras of prominence, but they both come in times covered by the Old Testament. Its first era of prominence was under the kingship of Nimrod himself, and then later it again came to the fore under the kingship of a man called Nebuchadnezzar. In 539 BC, the Babylonian Empire was attacked and captured by the Persian king Cyrus the Great. This ended Babylon's status as the most powerful kingdom on earth, and although there is evidence that the city remained an important cultural center and evidence that there were several rebellions by Babylonians against the new Persian Empire, hoping to re-establish Babylon's superiority, it was never resurrected. The physical empire of Babylon disappeared long ago. This is why when we get to the New Testament, which records events around 500 years after Babylon's demise, there is hardly any mention of it at all. Out of the 354 mentions of Babylon in the Bible, 342 come in the Old Testament. By the time of the New Testament, it had been long gone. Indeed, on the few occasions when it is mentioned, it is often just in reference to Old Testament events, except for one notable occasion where Peter uses it as a code word for Rome. This is because by the time of Jesus and the apostles, the Roman Empire was the new dominant power on the world stage and the Babylon of its day. The curious part of the whole thing, however, comes in Revelation, which prophesies the events that will occur at the end of time. God reveals the future to the writer, John, through a series of visions, and in Revelation 14, 16, 17, and 18, we find frequent references to Babylon. Given that Babylon had been long gone even by the time Revelation was written, it's intriguing to find God referring to it in the future tense. For example, in Revelation 18:21 we read, "Then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea, and said, 'With such violence the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again.'" Will be thrown down, future tense. Revelation 17:5 perhaps has the most famous reference to Babylon. It says, "This title was written on her forehead, Mystery Babylon, the great mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth." God's wrath and fury at Babylon is palpable in these passages. He is ready to crush it with such terminal violence that it will never again see the light of day or have any bearing on the world again. He calls it the source of the abominations of the earth. The language being used to describe it just couldn't be any stronger. In Revelation 16:19 we read, "God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath." Fury, wrath, violence. These are the words that describe a God filled with a terrifying and righteous anger. God utterly despises Babylon. But again, wasn't Babylon conquered over 500 years before Christ was even born? Revelation clearly and intriguingly shows that there is an element of Babylon that has survived until today and will survive until the end of time, something which is still influencing people, causing abominations, spiritual prostitution, and adultery. In Revelation 14:8 we read, "A second angel followed and said, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. In Revelation 18:2 we read, with a mighty voice he shouted, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a home for demons and a haunt for every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird. Babylon will fall, but it has not yet fallen. You see, Babylon is more than just an ancient city. As the Bible so clearly outlines, it is the source or fountainhead of evil that began thousands of years ago and is flowing throughout the history of mankind, affecting us even today in ways we don't realize. It represents a satanic system of rebellion against God's plan of salvation that has never ceased to exist in one form or another. The practices, symbolism, and perverted thought processes that originated there are still with us today. It has adopted various guises over time, but the common threads are there to be uncovered. It is the source of all abominations of the earth. This study is largely about following those threads from Genesis to Revelation and covering everything in between, so that people might learn to recognize them, avoid deception, and be stirred into action against their spiritual enemy. Before we look more at the city of Babylon itself, there's a character we have to quickly introduce ourselves to. Nimrod's wife and queen, a woman known today as Semiramis. It's important we learn about her because in many respects, she may be an even more important figure than her husband. Like Nimrod, it's hard to get an accurate idea of Semiramis that is untainted by legend, but the story goes something like this. When Noah's Ark settled on dry land again after the flood, the 8 people on board began to spread out and fill the areas of modern-day Iran, Turkey, and Syria. After probably another 500 to 600 years, they spread still further to Iraq. Some reckon this was simply because of increasing populations, and others say it may have had something to do with rivalries between the family lines of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons. At any rate, modern archaeology confirms that the people who occupied these areas were of the same race and culture, and the most reliable research indicates that it was from this region that animal husbandry, agriculture, metalwork, and citification spread throughout the earth. On this point, science and scripture are agreed. The only difference is the timescales involved. The Bible clearly states that these elements of civilization existed in the pre-flood world, but due to the unbelief of science, they have created a mythical Stone Age several millennia back in time to account for the evidence. It was in Iraq, or Mesopotamia as it was referred to then, that the first major post-flood cities were built. There were 7 major ones in total, and the name Land of 7 Cities was often referred to in ancient mythology. These are the 7 cities cited in the Bible as being conquered by Nimrod to establish his empire. We can gather that he probably came up from Ethiopia with his army via the Gulf on boats around 1,000 years after the flood. It was in the middle of the conquest of the area that Nimrod apparently met Semiramis. Tradition has it that she was a brothel keeper in the city of Erech. Although we don't know for certain that they met in that brothel, we can reasonably assume that their initial meeting was in quite unsavory and seedy circumstances. Nimrod made her his consort and his queen, but of course it wouldn't do to have a prostitute as a queen, so a story was invented that she was in fact a virgin that had sprung from the sea when Nimrod came ashore on his conquest of the area. This no doubt gave her an air of mystique and intrigue. Semiramis is actually a Greek form of her name, which was originally Samur Amat, which means gift of the sea. Semiramis rose to a position of power on the basis of her relationship with Nimrod, but as we'll see later, her influence eventually overwhelmingly obscured that of her husbands, both during their lifetimes and in the wider context of history. In appearance, she was noted for being outwardly extremely beautiful, but also for her gross immorality and licentiousness. No surprise given her professional background in the sex industry. Along with Nimrod, she helped rule the newly created empire of Babylon. With that cursory introduction to Semiramis, we can now explore the central monument of Nimrod's capital city, the Tower of Babel. This monument, commissioned by Nimrod, would be his power base, his castle, his palace, his throne. It's estimated that around 600,000 people were gathered together for its construction, and we find the motivation for it in Genesis 11, where the people say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." These lofty words may remind you of those spoken by Lucifer in Isaiah and Ezekiel. You said in your heart, "I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, on the utmost heights of the sacred mountain. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High." Notice the words sacred mountain, the idea that God resides atop a mountain. It is repeated again in Ezekiel 28 when God says, "You sinned, therefore I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you." Now, the Tower of Babel is often misrepresented in paintings. You'll often see it look something like this. But it was actually a kind of ziggurat, which is a pyramid-like shape. Indeed, from the Babylonian ziggurats we get similar structures in Egypt, Africa, and South America, remains of which can still be seen today and are amongst the world's most beloved tourist attractions. The reason that they are this particular shape is that they were built to represent mountains. Satan wants to be like God. He therefore mimics him in every way. The people Satan influences do likewise. Just as Satan wanted to ascend to the mountain of God to become God, the people he influenced were the same. Nimrod built the Tower of Babel to represent a sacred mountain, at the top of which he would have his throne room, his heaven, and he would rule from there not just as a king, but as a god. It represents the deification of man, the idea that man can become a god. It is the old serpent's lie from Eden. Nimrod's subjects would have to ascend up the steps of the mountain for his council. In a city full of low-lying, flat-topped roofs, he would literally be the Most High amongst them, a constant visual reminder to the people of his supremacy. Wherever they were within Babylon and for miles around, they would see the top of the tower and to know that their king and God was keeping a watchful eye over them from heaven, monitoring their every move. This would strike a mixture of fear and awe into his subjects. Nimrod was the initiator of the idea of emperor worship, although it may not have been his idea originally. Evidence suggests that Semiramis was actually the brains behind this concept, and that it was a clever device for helping them keep a tight grip on their subjects. She appeared to understand that a surefire route to gaining earthly honor, prestige, and power is through religious authority. Spiritual authority secures temporal authority. Nimrod was more than happy to go along with it, just as Adam was happy to go along with Eve in the Garden of Eden. By turning himself into a god and establishing emperor worship as a common practice, he maintained control over his subjects. Because of his association with fire and the sun, he became known as the sun god. His consort, Semiramis, understandably became associated with the other leading light in the sky, a moon goddess. Around themselves as the sun and moon gods, they created an entire religion that was based on a corruption of primeval astronomy developed by Noah's righteous ancestors prior to the flood. This religion has come to be known as the mystery religion. When we understand that the Tower of Babel was to represent a sacred mountain with a heaven at the top, new light is shed on Genesis 11:4, which to remind you reads, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." When the Bible describes the Tower of Babel as reaching to the heavens, this is often misconstrued as being a reference only to its physical height. The tower would undoubtedly have been the tallest building in the world at that point, but the Babylonians were not attempting to build some kind of structure that would literally reach into outer space. The Bible is simply confirming that it was a temple dedicated to the worship of Nimrod and Semiramis as part of a new satanic religious system. The temple or throne room at the peak of the tower may have been adorned with depictions of the zodiac, but we're talking about a metaphorical heaven rather than a physical one. It was heaven only inasmuch as it was the mountain where the gods of Nimrod and Semiramis sat. Many lesser ziggurats were built in the area and were given names like Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, or Temple which links heaven and earth, or Temple of the Stairway to Pure Heaven. And if that phrase made you think of a Led Zeppelin song, you're on the right track, but we'll get to that later. The Tower of Babel is also the origin of a symbol that almost everyone will be familiar with, particularly in the United States. This is called the all-seeing eye, and it stems from the idea in Babylon that King Nimrod, from his lofty vantage point in heaven, was keeping a watchful eye over everyone. This would strike a mixture of awe and terror into the citizens. There are a number of variations of this symbol. Sometimes we only get the eye within the triangle. Other times we see it atop a pyramid-type structure. Occasionally we just get the eye by itself. It all comes from the same source. But again, we must remember the Prince of Tyre, King of Tyre passage from Ezekiel. Satan intended to create a prince in the form of Nimrod through whom he could work out his plans from behind the scenes. The false religious system that Nimrod and Semiramis would establish to direct worship to themselves would by proxy direct worship to Satan as the hidden hand behind it all. Nimrod was a prince of Tyre, a type of Antichrist, who was a mere puppet for the king of Tyre. Therefore, when you see the all-seeing eye, you are not looking at the eye of Nimrod, but the eye of Lucifer or Satan. In everything we look at in this series, we have to remember to keep looking beyond the prince to see the king. Satan uses many vehicles, people, organizations, and structures to carry out his plans, but we shouldn't lose sight of the one who is behind them all. If we analyze Genesis 11:4 still further, we can discover more about the tower. Again, it says, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." The first word they say to each other is "come," and this establishes a unity between them. There was a coordination in what they were doing. It was carefully planned and considered, and the project was undertaken in the full knowledge of what it represented. When they say "come" to one another, they are coming together for 4 things. Number 1, to build a city. Number 2, to build a religious temple. Number 3, to glorify themselves or to establish their name or reputation. And number 4, to stop themselves being scattered over the earth. We have already established that the city of Babylon was Nimrod's secular act of defiance against God, a kingdom of man, by man, and for man's glory. We have also already seen that the location is especially significant, as it was built on or near the location of the Garden of Eden, signifying an attempt to return there to create a new Eden, a new humanistic or satanic paradise separate from God. We have also already established that the tower was a religious temple built in the shape of a sacred mountain from where Nimrod could rule his domain. This brings us to point 3, their intention to make a name for themselves. The English translation again partially masks the true meaning of these words. According to Roger Christopherson, the Hebrew text, "let us make a great name," reads, "let us provide our own salvation." In other words, people were attempting to work their way to salvation independently of God. This is the mark of every false religion, the idea that you can provide for or work your way towards glory by your own efforts. Christianity is the only religion whose adherents realize their need for a savior and their total dependence on him for salvation. Fourthly and finally, we also read that they were trying to stop from being scattered over the earth. This may appear to be a harmless desire that we should feel sympathy towards, but remember that God's original command to Adam and Eve, which he had reiterated to Noah after the flood, was to multiply and fill the earth. I believe God at least partly gave this command because spreading and diversifying would militate against what Satan was trying to achieve, unity under his false religious system. When the people chose to come together in one location under one system of governance, that was itself an act of rebellion against God, especially since that location was back at Eden, from where man had been expelled. We now need to explore the Babylonian religion of the Tower in a little more depth. As we've already noted, the religion created in Babylon by Nimrod and Semiramis is known as the Mystery Religion, or simply the Mysteries. At its core, it was an inverted retelling of the fall of man in Genesis. In the biblical account of the incident, the serpent caused Adam and Eve to sin against God by suggesting they eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge. Because they acted in disobedience to God, who had specifically told them not to eat from that tree, sin entered into the human race, and all the misery, disease, and tragedy that makes up human history stems from that moment. In the Babylonian inversion of this event, however, the serpent is portrayed as the real good God. He was worshipped for opening the eyes of men and for infusing the woman with his passion and lust. He was seen as a liberator and an enlightener. To them, he illuminated the minds of mankind by revealing to them the secret knowledge that God had tried to keep from them. Look again at the all-seeing eye. Notice that it has rays of light emanating from it. This represents the illuminating secret knowledge that he claims to offer, the secret serpent knowledge that could provide mankind with their own salvation and which would see them become gods. That is why the religion is called the Mysteries, because it claims to harbor the secret knowledge that was offered to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. In the Mysteries, the true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh, was portrayed as a wrathful deity of hate who was guilty of opposing freedom of choice. Because Nimrod and Semiramis set themselves up as the sun and moon gods, the religion was also based on a corruption of primeval astronomy. It was believed by Noah's righteous ancestors that the stars told the story of Satan's rebellion against God in heaven, his fall, subversion of mankind, the promise of a Messiah who would suffer and die to lift the curse of sin, and then be installed as Lord of creation and conqueror of Satan. These stories were widely known amongst the people of the time. Semiramis, however, again inverted the story, and so in the mystery version, the stars of the sky told a different story. In the Babylonian version, Satan was depicted as the rightful lord of the universe, whose throne had only temporarily been usurped by God. One day, an Antichrist, a seed of the serpent, would be born of a divine mother, would become God himself, replace God, and return rulership of the world to the serpent. Semiramis claimed that this was the real, hidden truth concealed within the stories. This corrupt and satanic version is the origin of astrology, which still exists virtually unchanged today. The Babylonians didn't just believe the stars told the story of the universe. They believed you could divine the future of individuals through them as well. If the stars told the story of things that had passed, they could also tell the stories of things to come. They would therefore divide the sky into sections and give meanings to each section on the basis of the stars that are found there. According to the theory, a person's destiny is said to be determined by whatever section or sign he is born under. This is the origin of horoscopes. In times to come, astrology would pass to the empire of ancient Egypt, which is the place we most associate with pyramids today. The sacred mountain pyramids were constructed with certain mathematical relationships to the stars. The Sphinx also has astrological significance. It has the head of a woman, symbolizing Virgo, the Virgin, and the body of a lion, symbolizing Leo. Virgo is the first sign of the zodiac, and Leo is the last. So the Sphinx, which literally means joining in Greek, is the meeting point of the zodiac, indicating that the Egyptian priests believed Egypt was the center of the universe. By the time Moses led the Jews out of Egypt in Exodus, astrology had also infected the population in Canaan, which was the land that they were headed towards. Hence, some of the strictest warnings in the Bible against astrology date from this period, such as in Leviticus 19:31 and Deuteronomy 18. The biblical denunciations of astrology identify the practice with demonism or Satanism. in the sense that Satan and his hosts were actually being worshipped in the guise of the signs, planets, and stars. And as mentioned previously, the leading lights of the sky, sun and moon, were worshipped in the form of Nimrod and Semiramis. Very significantly, a third leading light was identified in the sky that was 23 times more luminous than the sun, and therefore was considered to be the most important star in the sky. This star is known as the dog star, Sirius, or the morning star, because it's still visible even in the morning light. Remember in Isaiah 14:12, Lucifer is referred to as that name. When allied with the sun and moon, the morning star completes an unholy trinity of lights personified in Satan, Nimrod, and Semiramis. One of the key elements of the mysteries that I also want to emphasize is the hierarchical structure that they contained. The secret illuminating knowledge from the serpent was not to be freely distributed to the unworthy. You would have to become initiated into the religion and then work your way through ascending degrees of revelation and knowledge. This ascension through the levels was considered to be a journey from the darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge, a process of enlightenment. Progression was propagated by a hierarchy of priests and priestesses, and were marked by fearful rites of passage and oaths of secrecy, which, if broken, would lead to death. Similar oaths of secrecy are sworn today by other hierarchical institutions, like the Freemasons and Jesuits, but more about them later. The further along in the process you were, the more enlightened you were considered. The more enlightened you were, the more you could look down your nose at the unenlightened. The hierarchical structure of the mysteries was designed to create inequality amongst men based on what they knew. It can itself be best visualized in the form of a pyramid or ziggurat again, wide at the base and increasingly narrow as you rise through the levels towards the peak. The idea is that there's an average mass of people at the bottom of the pyramid who are ignorant, blind fools, with an increasingly small number of enlightened people towards the top. The very top, the capstone as it were, is Lucifer himself, the giver of light. If you've read or seen Harry Potter, you'll be vaguely familiar with this concept. In those stories, the name Muggle is given to the majority of people in the world who go about their lives utterly oblivious to the wizarding world that is actually all around them, or at least very close at hand. We are encouraged to think of Muggles as idiots, and indeed the Oxford English Dictionary has even picked up on the word and defines it as an individual who is clumsy or unable to acquire a new skill. Those who were born into a Muggle family but have been awakened to wizardry are called mudbloods, i.e. half-bloods, and this places you on a higher position than a Muggle, but a lower position to those who have centuries of pure wizardry in their ancestry. J.K. Rowling here, as in many aspects of her books, is actually giving insights into real occultism. The word occult means hidden or concealed, and it is the modern name by which the ideas of the mysteries have come to be known today. When you have people involved in the occult, the information, knowledge, and power that they are trying to tap into is the exact same as that serpent knowledge which originated in Babylon. The idea of occultism retains the concept that there are a powerful, enlightened, or illuminated few at the top who see things as they really are, and the rest are kept in the dark, mere ignorant fools. The enlightened few consider the average mass of people to be almost subhuman, like cattle, who deserve to be led like cattle and treated like cattle. This knowledge hierarchy is replicated in almost all occult societies today, like Freemasonry, for example, and it fulfills an important function of allowing Satan to pervert by small degrees. Those at the lower levels of Freemasonry have absolutely no idea of what they are actually involved in. It is only as they slowly rise through the degrees that they have the true information revealed to them. By perverting in small stages and in the passing of time, people lose sight of just how far they're straying and can be led to accept things that they would otherwise have flatly rejected if they had been given the full revelation from the start. Just a little change here, a little change there, it's not so much. And yet with enough small changes and with enough time, a person or society can be completely transformed without even realizing it. This is one of the reasons why we must have a zero-tolerance policy with sin. The concessions we make today will form a link in a chain of concessions in future if we're not careful. This kind of system that needs to keep knowledge concealed from the masses, by its very nature, necessitates the use of symbolism, gestures, monuments, secret words, and signs to ensure that those in the dark are kept in the dark. That's why the occult makes heavy use of these devices. They use symbols that are packed with meaning for the initiated, but which mean absolutely nothing to the average man. By using symbols, information can be communicated by being hidden in plain sight. That is, they are in the open air for all to see, but they are not recognized or interpreted by the average person. It is also for this reason that the occult always hides behind outward facades of neutrality, goodness, or even holiness. I mentioned this earlier, but don't expect evil to have an obvious outward appearance of evil. That's not how Satan wins people to himself. More often than not, he disguises himself as an angel of light to seduce, which is why discernment becomes one of our most important tools in these last days. It is also for the same reason that dual meanings are prevalent in the occult world. Wherever there is a dark infernal truth to be communicated, there is almost always a false but light and seemingly good cover story. The public are given the false cover story in order to keep the dark truth concealed. The initiated and the enlightened only are aware of the true meanings. By using the system of double-speak and deception, occultists can speak a sentence containing words which mean something to fellow occultists, but which mean something very different to the average person. Bernie Taupin, Elton John's lyricist, is reported to have once said that he never wrote a single song that wasn't written in this doublespeak. The average listener hears Elton John's lyrics and either doesn't discern a message at all or thinks they discern a light and wholesome one, while in reality they are telling quite a different message to the initiated. Closely related to this concept is the idea that light and darkness emanate from the same source. Nimrod and Semiramis were the sun and the moon, the leading lights of the day and night, but they were two separate manifestations of the same source, Satan. So the idea is that there's one force which has a light masculine side and a dark feminine side. If you've seen Star Wars, you'll be familiar with this concept. The force is considered neutral, but can be used for good or evil. Or what about the Wizard of Oz, where it's explained that there can be good witches or bad witches? This is key to occultism. The power is neutral, it's how you use it that counts. And speaking of songs with double meanings, Bernie Taupin also, of course, wrote the lyrics to a Wizard of Oz related song, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. The Wizard of Oz has an occult message that we'll get to later. But these are themes that have infiltrated our culture, and these are some of the key telltale signs of satanic mystery religion. Look out for them as we continue our journey. A final feature of the mysteries was its absolute obsession with sex, and this is again something that carries on into modern occultism. Because of Semiramis' history as a brothel keeper, we should be unsurprised to find sexual perversion playing a huge role in her religion, and that indeed is what we do find. Worship of both male and female regenerative parts, but particularly the male phallus, played a key role. There was ritualistic sensual dancing, sacred prostitution and sodomy with male and female prostitutes. Sex was seen as an act of worship and was encouraged in all its most perverted forms. The religion was also notable for its vicious blood rituals, where animals and children were brutally sacrificed. Because sex was involved in the worship, unwanted babies often resulted, and they were sacrificed on the altar of this depraved system. The religion also involved the use of magic, conjuring, channeling, and sorcery. In fact, the worship in the religion involved the most vile and evil forms of immorality imaginable. Now, in the end, we know that Nimrod met a violent and untimely death, but there are contrasting stories as to why and how it happened. Some have suggested it was at the hands of Shem's descendants, who had become outraged at what Nimrod was attempting to do in Babylon. Others suggest it was an act of rebellion by a band of his subjects. The most intriguing and most shocking version of events, however, is that he was killed by Semiramis, his wife. Nimrod was by all accounts a brilliant tactician, but it seems he made a fatal flaw in allowing Semiramis to retain control over the religion. because it was the religion that was the true source of power behind his rule. Through it, she won the hearts and minds of the people, and she used it to her advantage when a schism developed between herself and Nimrod. She had become pregnant with an illegitimate son. When Nimrod heard about this, he threatened to dethrone her and expose her true origins as a prostitute, but Semiramis retaliated by devising a plot to overthrow him and retain power for herself. The story goes that she had the priests kill him on her behalf at an annual New Year feast. The Babylonian people were then given a cover story to explain his death, and when she eventually gave birth to her illegitimate son, she further claimed to the people that he was an immaculately conceived reincarnation of Nimrod. She called him Tammuz and presented him as the seed of the woman mentioned back in Genesis 3, the Messiah. We know that this verse really refers to Jesus Christ, and so Tammuz was the first Christ imposture, the first Antichrist. Semiramis's rule in the aftermath of this event appeared to be rather shaky, and because of the increased threat to her safety, she took to building walls, towers, and gates around the city of Babylon to defend herself. She was actually the first to build fortifications of this type, and therefore became so associated with this concept that in later times she was often depicted with a crown of turrets. To secure her position, she increasingly emphasized her position as the Mother of God and the Queen of Heaven. In other words, she continued to use religious motivation to keep power. As Tammuz grew up and reached maturity, he began demanding to be installed as the new king. Not only did Semiramis refuse this, but seeing that he was becoming a threat to her rule, concocted a plan to have him disposed of in the same manner she disposed of Nimrod. Tammuz, however, caught wind of her scheme and ran her through with a sword before she had the chance to implement it. He then purged the priesthood of all who wouldn't swear allegiance to him to consolidate his position within the religion. This ended Semiramis's 102-year rule. It did not, however, end her relevance. After death, Nimrod continued to be worshipped as the sun god. After Semiramis's death, she continued to be worshipped as the moon goddess, and they continued to be represented by the leading lights of the sky. Semiramis, also known as the Great Mother, Divine Mother, Virgin Mother, etc., would often be depicted standing on a crescent moon with stars encircling her head. Both Nimrod and Semiramis were also given new names in their post-life godly form. Nimrod was confirmed by the priest of the religion as a god called Marduk, and Semiramis was confirmed as a goddess called Astarte. These names, however, were never revealed to the masses, but instead their attributes were set forth under pseudonyms of various gods constructed for the public interest. For example, in Christian terms, we can call God Jehovah Jireh, meaning the Lord who provides, or Jehovah Nissi, which means the Lord is my banner, but we know these different names refer to the same God. In Babylon, however, these different names, which represented different parts of Nimrod's and Semiramis's character, morphed into separate entities altogether, and polytheism, multiple god worship, was truly born. Some of Marduk's alter egos, for example, included Enki or Apsu, who was the god of wisdom, incantations, and deep water oceans. Another was Astaluhi, the god of healing and exorcism. Another was Nebo or Nebul, who was believed to have come out of a cave or hole in the ground, and so worship ceremonies were held for Nebo underground. This cave theme became significant in Babylonian beliefs and is a recurring theme. It also curiously echoes Revelation 13, which talks of a beast coming out of the ground. The names Nebul and Bel became the official names of Marduk in later periods, and were popular in these same periods among the ruling classes of Babylon as name elements. In the same way that Muslims are often named Muhammad after their prophet, Babylonians often had names like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Marduk was known as Baal. This was the primary name by which the other nations, including Israel, were introduced to the worship of Marduk. Baal means Lord or Master, and was from very early times known as the sun god. Under this name, with many prefixes and suffixes, he was worshipped by the Canaanites, Phoenicians, Syrians, and to some extent by the Egyptians. The name Baal sometimes occurs in connection with a locality. For example, in Peor, he was known as Baal Peor, or in Hermon, Baal Hermon. More frequently, it occurs with compound attributes such as Baal-zebub, which means Lord of the Flies, still today one of the epithets of Satan. Zebub, meaning fly, comes from the root word that signifies restless motion, and so Baal-zebub has a double meaning as Lord of restless and unsettled motion. This agrees precisely with the characteristics of Satan as described in Job 1:7. Baal-zephon, another famous version, means Lord of the Black North or the Northern Void, and Meribal translates as Lord of the Rebellion. All these different names are just different sides of the same dice. They all originate with Marduk, who is Nimrod. Finally, because all pagan gods and goddesses originated with the dysfunctional human family of Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz, and the Babylonian system, this clearly affected the views of what the gods and goddesses were like in ancient times. The gods were given family-type structures. The gods had affairs, they argued, they competed for position. They were as prone to family and relational problems as any human. Like Babylon's first family, they even killed each other. Put simply, they were humanized. The Babylonian religion developed in such a way that men began to envision their gods in conformity with the image of man. The gods of the Babylonians were not only understood to interact with each other and operate their affairs as humans do, but they also behaved like humans or worse. As one modern poet wrote, "The more the gods become like men, the easier it is for men to believe the gods. When both have only human appetites, then rogues may worship rogues." When sinful perversion and wickedness took hold of the world the first time, God sent a flood to wipe the slate clean and start it again. However, our study so far has shown that within just a few generations of the floodwaters receding, wickedness was already re-establishing itself in the world, with Babylon at its epicenter. It seems that as long as people are unified and left to their own devices, the result will always be a swift descent into degradation, the natural state of the unreformed human heart. God had already promised not to reset the world with a flood again, and even if he did, it would only be a few generations before he would need to do it again. C.S. Lewis put this well in Mere Christianity. What Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors was the idea that they could be like gods, could set up on their own as if they had created themselves, be their own masters, invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside of God, apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history. Money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, empires, classes, slavery. The long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. The reason why it can never succeed is this. God invented us as a man invents an engine. A car is made to run on gasoline, and it would not run on anything else. Now God designed the human machine to run on himself. He himself is the fuel our spirits were designed to burn, or the food our spirits were designed to feed on. There is no other. That is why it is just no good asking God to make us happy in our own way without bothering about religion. God cannot give us a happiness and a peace apart from himself, because it is not there. There is no such thing. That is the key to history. Terrific energy is expended, civilizations are built up, excellent institutions devised, but each time something goes wrong. Some fatal flaw always brings the selfish and cruel people to the top, and it all slides back into misery and ruin. In fact, the machine conks. It seems to start up all right and runs a few yards, and then it breaks down. They are trying to run it on the wrong juice. That is what Satan has done to us humans. To solve this problem, instead of wiping everything out and starting again every few generations, God had a far more subtle but long-lasting solution. So long-lasting that it is only now, in the 21st century, that mankind is getting close to reversing it. He said, "Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they won't be able to understand each other." The key to confounding the building of the Tower of Babel and the satanic agenda that it represented was to confuse their language, thus inhibiting them from working together. It brought confusion and eventually caused them to scatter, leaving their plans unfinished. In that way, the Lord scattered them all over the world. Babel literally translates as confusion, and it is the word through which we get Babel in English. But as the people scattered, they carried with them the remnants of their mystery Babylon religion wherever they went. This religious system of muddled half-truths and inversions of the truth spread across the globe, and it formed the wellspring for all subsequent false religions and endless mythological systems. And this is where the story gets trickier to follow. As the people scattered outwards from Babylon and into the rest of the world, the single, easily identifiable mystery religion became different things in different places at different times. Marduk or Nimrod, Astarte or Semiramis, and Tammuz had already been given multiple names to represent different parts of their character, and had then developed into distinct personalities as legends and myths cropped up around them. These distinct personalities were then assigned to various aspects of daily living. There was the god of war, the god of the sea, the god of fertility, and the sun god, etc. Indeed, a god or goddess for just about everything. So we already had perhaps hundreds of gods. But because everyone now spoke a different language and they had moved to different regions around the world, these gods and goddesses assumed different names depending on the location. In Greece, Astarte became known as Aphrodite or Athena. In Egypt, she became Isis. In Canaan, she became Ishtar. In Ephesus, she became Diana. In Israel, she became Ashtoreth. The Phrygians knew her as Cybele. In Phoenicia, she is known as Europa. In Rome, she was known as Ceres and Venus. As the goddess of the Lima, she is Nuit, Tanuit, or Anuit. In India, she became Kali. So the gods multiplied and hundreds became thousands. It's estimated that there are around 5,000 different names altogether for the goddess stemming from Semiramis alone. As I read those names, some of them will have rang a bell while others will be more obscure. Names like Aphrodite and Venus are still widely known. Others like Demeter and Cybele are now mostly unheard of. Or on the male side, you will have heard of Apollo, Mars, Achilles, or Poseidon, but may perhaps be less familiar with Nebo or Nabul. The names that are still well known tend to be the Greek or Roman forms, mainly because they had such great empires, and as a result their mythologies were most widely spread, written about, and preserved. So well preserved that they are still household names. There are shaving products named after Venus. We had a NASA rocket ship called Apollo. We've had movies like Troy starring Brad Pitt as Achilles, in which some of these muddled half-truth stories and legends of heroes are depicted. The name Europa has even become the name of a whole continent, but they all go back to just 3 people from Babylon: Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz. You can see the common threads if you look for them. You will see recurring titles such as Queen of Heaven, the Great Mother, Mother Goddess, or even Mother Nature. You will see how it is just one woman under different names, and that she has existed in all cultures and civilizations throughout history. You'll also see how all those ancient mythologies contain family relationships and feuds, very often culminating in murder and incest. You'll see the recurring theme of mother and child cults that began with Semiramis and Tammuz. You'll see these threads uniting even major religions of today like Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Catholicism. You'll discover, in fact, that all false religions sprang from the mystery Babylon religion, and that is why they have these commonalities. Keeping track of all the routes the Babylonian religious system took, however, is impossible and also unnecessary. We don't need to do an in-depth analysis of how the mysteries became Hinduism in India or Buddhism in the Far East, for example. We only need to focus on a few threads, namely how the mystery spread from the Middle East into Europe. The key point at this stage, however, is to understand that all mythological systems and false religion and gods and goddesses can be traced back to just 3 people in Babylon, and behind their mystery religion is Satan himself. So the whole earth was starting to be overrun with polytheism, and the idea of godhood was degraded in the minds of men. Time for some good news. God didn't just sit back and let the whole thing spiral out of control. Instead, he set in motion a plan to reveal himself to the world. And just as the beginning of the world began with one man in Adam, and the beginning of the post-flood world began in one man through Noah, the beginning of this plan of redemption began with another solitary figure called Abraham. It was through Noah's son Ham that Nimrod was born, but it was through the lineage of another of his 3 sons, Shem, that we find Abraham's lineage. The Lord called Abraham, saying, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you." God goes on to say in Genesis 18:19, "I have singled him out so that he will direct his sons and their families to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just." God's plan was to create a group of people, a nation, that would belong to him in the midst of the world that had fallen prey to the satanic mystery Babylon system. This nation would become Israel, and these people would become known as the Jews. And through this single group, he would execute his stunning plan for the redemption of the world. He would reveal himself to them so that he could reveal himself through them to the rest of the world. The Old Testament is the story of how God revealed himself to them. It's the story of God introducing himself to his people, teaching them his character, what he wants from them, how they should think of him and refer to him. Like most relationships, it has a lot of ups and downs along the way, but the whole story has been faithfully recorded that the rest of us might also read about and know God for ourselves through their efforts and mistakes. Consequently, we can on that alone agree that all the families of the earth truly have been blessed through the Jews as promised in Genesis 12, 1-3. The culmination of God's master plan would be Jesus, the glorious Messiah prophesied about in Genesis 3, the one who would crush the serpent's head. His death and resurrection was the decisive blow in the war with Satan, but it all began with one faithful man, Abraham. It wasn't that Abraham was especially righteous. In fact, he had a pagan background like most other people, but God can use anyone for his purposes. In fact, inadequacy almost helps because it causes men to rely on God when they might otherwise be tempted to rely on themselves. Abraham received the promise that he would be the beginning of a great nation when he was already around 75 years old. Sarah was barren and they were childless. Humanly speaking, what God was promising was impossible. Abraham's faith faltered as he just couldn't see how it would be possible for him to become the father of any child, let alone one that would be so important. Sarah suggested that they could force the issue in their own strength, without God, by having a son with their Egyptian slave girl Hagar instead. Abraham did this, and the son was called Ishmael. However, this child that had come about from their own human efforts was not the one God had promised. Instead, even later in life, Sarah eventually miraculously conceived. This child of the promise was called Isaac, and it was through him that the Jewish nation came to be. Isaac then had a son called Jacob, and this is why God is thereafter regularly referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They are following this lineage to make it distinct from the lineage that came from his other son, Ishmael. However, because Ishmael was also a child of Abraham, God promised that he would turn him into a great nation too. Ishmael is the first of the people group we now know as the Arabs. God said, "Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted, but I will also make a nation of the descendants of Hagar's son, because he is your son too." The rest of the Old Testament is basically the story of this nation that became known as Israel, this people group that became known as the Jews, and how they stood alone as God's people in a world full of mystery Babylon religion, manifested as polytheism, sorcery, and astrology. They were often persecuted, attacked, enslaved, driven out from their land, but God revealed himself to them and through them to the world. They keep losing faith in him, and God keeps showing them that they can trust him. They turn their back on him, and God chases after them. As we move through the Old Testament years, we will see evidence of this. Incidentally, the fact that Isaac replaced the firstborn Ishmael as the favored son is a spiritual root for the Arabs' hatred of the Jews. As descendants of Ishmael, the Islamic world retains the same bitterness and animosity toward Israel as Ishmael had towards Isaac. As we fast forward from Abraham past Isaac and past Jacob, we get to Jacob's son Joseph, and you will no doubt know his famous story. The youngest brother in the family, he was beaten and sold into slavery by his older brothers. Many years of slavery, false accusation, and imprisonment later, he ended up in Egypt, where he becomes second in command to Pharaoh, the Egyptian prime minister. He was later reconciled with his brothers, and the whole family moved to Egypt to be with him there. It is while there in Egypt that the Jewish people really began to multiply. The Bible describes it like this. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. So just 70 went to Egypt, but before long they were multiplying and filling the land. After some 400 years of multiplication, the memory of Joseph and that generation disappeared, and the Egyptian Pharaoh began to fear that the Jews were becoming too numerous. He regarded them as a threat to national security and imagined that if they were ever to make war against their hosts, it would cause a big problem. From this paranoia, he decided to oppress them with forced labor, with the idea of keeping the numbers down. However, they continued to multiply and prosper even under these terms, to such a degree that Pharaoh took more drastic action, enslaving them and subjugating them under Egyptian rule. Again, to try and keep their numbers down, he commanded that all Jewish boys be killed the moment they are born. At this point, God stepped in by calling Moses to lead his people out of Egypt, through the desert, and into the freedom of a promised land flowing with milk and honey. Pharaoh, as you'll know, dug his heels in and refused to let God's people go. In response to this stubbornness, God sent 10 plagues. Now, lest you think we're getting off track here, it's important to realize that these plagues were not arbitrary. They were in fact direct attacks on the false gods that had originated in Babylon. Before looking at the plagues individually, it's worth highlighting a curious phenomenon at this point. I remember hearing of someone who developed some kind of obsession with a 1970s book movie album called Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which was demonically inspired. When the demon that had gained a foothold in the person's life through the music was being expelled and it began manifesting, the person took on the characteristics of a seagull. He began flapping and squawking like a bird. From this example and others, it appears that when human beings create an idol or god associated with something, a real demon is assigned to the position to become the object of their affections. So in a sense, the god becomes real, but only in that it is a demonic entity. This makes a certain amount of sense. When Lucifer was trying to get the angels to follow him in his rebellion, remember the motivation he gave them was that he could give them a higher position in his kingdom than they had in God's. Lucifer told them that he would give them a position whereby they would be worshipped as gods themselves and would have positions of power and prominence. These fallen angels who accepted his offer will therefore want to be worshipped like gods, and it probably explains from a spiritual perspective why polytheism became rife. Behind each of the thousands, if not millions of gods or goddesses are demons who want to be worshipped and so take on roles whereby men will venerate them. But remembering the pyramid structure, there are more powerful ones and less powerful ones in Satan's organized kingdom. Keep that in mind now as we look at the 10 plagues God sent upon the Egyptians to force them into letting his chosen people go, because what we'll find is that with each plague, he was in fact taking the opportunity to show his authority over their demonic gods. For example, the first plague that God visited upon the Egyptians was to turn the water of the Nile and indeed all the water in Egypt to blood. This was not some random whim, a magic trick to wow and amaze Pharaoh. It was a calculated sniper shot aimed directly at the Egyptian god of the Nile, Hapi. God was showing Egypt that their gods were powerless against him. But much more than this, the show of superiority was primarily for the benefit of the Jews. Still new in their relationship, God wanted to show them that they could trust him, that he really was the true God, and that he had complete superiority over the Egyptian form of the Babylonian gods that they were surrounded with. There were also several other gods that would also have been shown up by this miracle. Although Hapi was considered to be the spirit of the Nile, they believed a god called Khnum was its guardian. Some also believed that the Nile was the bloodstream of the god Osiris, and therefore it was fitting that God actually turned it into blood. All these were completely feeble in the presence of Almighty God. The second plague was an infestation of frogs. Again, this was not arbitrary, but a show of God's superiority over Heket, goddess of fertility, water, and renewal. The third plague was lice from the dust of the earth, and this was God's show of superiority over the Egyptian god Geb, god of the earth. The fourth plague was swarms, most probably of flies, and this was God's show of superiority over the Egyptian god Khepri. He had the head of a fly and was the god of creation, movement of the sun, and rebirth. The fifth plague was the death of cattle and livestock. This was God's show of superiority over the Egyptian goddess Hathor. Hathor was originally worshipped in the form of a cow, and she was later represented as a woman with the head of a cow and then finally with just a human head. She was the symbolic mother of Pharaoh. The sixth plague was boils and sores, and this was God's show of superiority over Isis. Isis is the goddess of medicine and peace. It would also have been an affront to Imhotep, Serapis, and Thoth, the gods of knowledge, healing, intelligence, and medical learning. Notice how Isis is depicted with a tower on her head, like the crown Semiramis wore. This is because Isis was the direct Egyptian equivalent. The seventh plague was hail, and this was God's show of superiority over the Egyptian goddess of the sky, Nut. It was also an affront to Shu, the wind god, and Horus, the hawk-headed sky god. Isis and Seth supposedly protected the crops, but the burned fields were a testimony to their impotence in the face of Almighty God. The eighth plague was locusts sent from the sky. This was primarily God's show of superiority over the god of crops, Seth. It was also an affront to Nepri, the god of grain, Ermutet, the goddess of childbirth and crops, Isis once more, and Thermuthis, the goddess of fertility and harvest. The ninth plague was 3 days of complete darkness. This was God's show of superiority over the sun god Ra. Once again, the various other Egyptian gods were powerless as well. Notice the serpent around the sun in this picture. You may have noticed that Egyptian pharaohs also wore headpieces with serpents at the front. Finally, the 10th plague sent by God was the death of all the firstborn sons. God says in Exodus 12:12 that this plague was a plague of judgment on all the gods of Egypt, and would show their total inability to protect their subjects from the hands of Almighty God. In the face of unparalleled tragedy, all the gods of Egypt were silent. Meshkinnet, the goddess who presided at the birth of children, Min, the god of procreation, Isis, the goddess of fertility, Selket, the guardian of life, Renenutet, the cobra goddess and guardian of Pharaoh. It was also an attack on the god that was considered to be the greatest of them all in Egypt, Pharaoh himself. It should also be remembered that this plague was the exact thing Pharaoh had tried to do to the Jewish people. He had commanded that all Jewish males be killed the moment they are born, and so God turned that back upon the Egyptians. The curse Pharaoh pronounced on the Jews bounced back upon himself. This is a common thing with God. The evil people intend to do to the Jews, God turns back on them, thus fulfilling the promise that he had given to Abraham, that he would bless those that bless Israel and curse those who curse them. The number 10 represents completeness in pagan numerology, and so these plagues combined indicated the completeness of God's power over these false, demonic gods and goddesses. God isn't done showing his supremacy over idols, by the way. In Revelation, we read that at the end of time, when the sixth seal is opened, the sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, the whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth. So at the end of time, God will show his supremacy over the sun, the moon, and the stars, which would be a symbolic picture of his supremacy over Baal as the sun god, Asherah as the moon goddess, and the multitudes of smaller demonic gods in the form of the stars. As far as our study goes, you can forget all the names for the Egyptian gods we've just been reading about, but remember Osiris, Isis, and Horus. These are the primary Egyptian forms of the Babylonian trinity, Baal, Asherah, and Tammuz. Eventually, Pharaoh let the Jews go, as documented in the book of Exodus, but after the dramatic and miraculous escape into the wilderness, they lost faith in the God who had liberated them, and after just 2 months in the wilderness, they were drawn back to the worship of false gods in the desert, the same gods that they'd been surrounded with all their lives in Egypt. While Moses was at the top of Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the people at the foot of the mountain began to wonder if he was ever coming down again. They lost faith and demanded that new gods be made to show them the way. They built a golden calf and claimed that this was the God that had led them out of slavery. Now, why a golden calf? Well, remember that Nimrod was represented by a bull and had a crown of bull horns because the Chaldean word for ruler also meant bull. Thus, a bull was chosen to symbolize Nimrod in his worship, and gold was chosen because gold was a depiction of the color of the sun. Incidentally, have you ever wondered why Satan is often depicted with bull horns coming out of his head? And have you ever wondered why Hindus regard bulls as sacred? It seems random, doesn't it? But now you know. Look for the threads, connect the dots, and you'll always end up back at Babylon. With your understanding of Babylon from the series so far, you should begin to see connections you hadn't seen before. Following after the abominable patterns of worship set by Nimrod and Semiramis, which included sexual rituals and fornication, Moses returned from the mountain to find the Israelites defiling themselves by reveling in this kind of behavior. They defiled themselves in every sense by worshipping this satanic god, allowing idols into their camp, and in the depraved acts they perpetrated in his name. Now we have already seen examples of the cancerous spread of wickedness in the world, and the same was threatening to happen amongst God's chosen people here. Moses had to take swift action to purge the camp. A little yeast is quick to infect the whole batch, and the Jews simply had to be kept holy. They were absolutely vital to God's master plan of salvation for the world. If they too were lost to paganism, there was no hope for mankind. The whole world would be doomed to hellish misery and destruction. If the Jews did not survive as a righteous people devoted to God, then there would be no people group through whom Jesus could be born. The Messiah, who was destined to die on a cross for the sins of the world, overcoming death and Satan in the process to free mankind from the yoke of slavery it was currently under, could not come. The Bible that tells us about those events would never have been written, meaning we would be without hope. The very existence of hope, life, and liberty hinged on what happened to the Jews. It was that important. Moses made a tough decision. He asked all those who were on the Lord's side to come to him. They were then told to strap on their swords and kill those who weren't. Around 3,000 died that day. This incident is used by modern atheists to portray God as a bloodthirsty monster, unworthy of worship. But if those 3,000 hadn't died, and the Jews had turned to paganism and Jesus hadn't come, I doubt if there would even be a world today. And if there was, it would be hell on earth. Satan would be running amok, and there would be nothing but wickedness, depravity, pain, and misery. We only have to look in further detail at some of the practices associated with the ancient gods to get an idea. For example, take Molech, who is the form of Marduk or Nimrod worshipped by the Ammonites. We read in Leviticus that part of their rituals involved child sacrifice and cannibalism. God warned Moses about this repeatedly. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed, to be passed through the fire to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Human sacrifices and fire were part of Nimrod's worship from the very earliest days, of course, because fire was seen to be the earthly representation of the sun. Later, in Jeremiah 32:35, we read, They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters, causing them to pass through fire to Molech, though I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind that they should do such a detestable thing and so make Judah sin. In the same way God's priests in the tabernacle used the meat of the animal sacrifices for food, so the priests of Baal did also eat of their human sacrifices. In fact, this is where we get the word cannibal from. The Chaldean Cana Baal means priest of Baal. Don't let anyone attempt to portray God as a murderous villain, slaughtering innocent women and children. We are talking about the defeat of depravity from the pit of hell. People who sacrificed their own children and ate their flesh. The camp had to be kept holy, a concept our world understands little about. We should also see in this episode the burning hatred God has for sin, and remember how vital it is for us to remain righteous in His sight today. Because of Jesus, there is now no need for bloodshed when we sin, and this has perhaps diminished our understanding of its severity. We should remember, however, that the punishment for sin is as severe today as it always has been. It's just that Jesus already spilled His blood so that we don't have to. When we sin, we deserve death just as much as those Israelites who turned away from God. Thank Jesus He has taken the punishment on our behalf. Perhaps as further punishment for that generation, perhaps to build character, perhaps to continue the purging process, and perhaps because we develop a deeper relationship with God in times of trial, almost certainly a mixture of all four of these, God decided to keep them in the desert for 40 more years. God needed to get these people to trust Him and to build a relationship with Him, and the wilderness, a place where they had to rely on Him even for food and water, served that purpose. One final thing I'd like to highlight about the desert years. Notice how God chose to reveal Himself to Moses. He chose to reveal Himself at the top of Mount Sinai, a mountain. Remember that Babylonian ziggurats were built to represent mountains, and the apexes were said to be where the gods lived. Remember, this is as a result of Satan's desire to be the Most High. Because all ancient mythologies and false religions stem from Babylon, you'll find parallels of this in many cultures. Mount Olympus, for example, is famously where the Greek gods were supposed to have lived. The fact that God revealed Himself to Moses at the top of a mountain clearly echoes this idea. It is likely God did this so the Israelites could understand what was going on when Moses ascended Sinai. They were used to the idea that deities lived at the top of mountains. This appears to be God using what they already knew to communicate that He was their God, talking to them in a symbolic language they could understand. And since ziggurats were built by man to glorify man, and their gods were said to reside there, God was showing His superiority again by revealing Himself atop a mountain that He'd made, a real one, and on ground that was so much higher than any ziggurat. What God was saying to His people is that He was the real Most High. Just to connect some more dots with this, remember that Jesus' most famous sermon is the Sermon on the Mount. This wasn't an accident. By choosing that location, He was subtly revealing Himself in the symbolic language to be God. You see, the Bible starts to reveal extra layers when you understand the nature of the battle. When the Israelites eventually did reach the Promised Land, the first thing they were commanded by God to do was to destroy all the altars and images that had been set up there by pagan tribes to honor Baal and Asherah. Once more, we see an assistance from God that their camp is kept clean. Holiness is paramount. The fate of the world is resting on these people. Instead of doing so, they ended up turning their back on God and worshipping the idols again. The lure of the gods that surround them and the culture in which they have been steeped keeps polluting and sidetracking God's people, and God is constantly disciplining them and drawing them back into Him. The battle between God and Satan for this people group manifests itself as a tug of war, where the Israelites are constantly rebelling and being restored. The determination of Satan to destroy the relationship the Jews have with God throughout the Bible is very clear. They were, after all, fast becoming the last barrier between him and total domination. He wasn't about to leave them alone. And at this point, I want to introduce you to an absolutely vital point which will develop in the following parts. I call it Satan's Plan A and Plan B, and it crops up constantly, so we really need to get a hold of it. What Satan wants above everything else is domination or control. Now, there are two ways to achieve this. One way is considered the feminine way, which is employed in a position of weakness. It's called manipulation. If women are to attempt to control their husbands or anyone else, this is generally how they do it, through tears, hurt feelings, emotional blackmail, etc. The second way of achieving domination is considered the masculine way, and it's employed when in a position of strength, and it's through violence or intimidation. This is generally how men control people, by threatening them with their strength. So there's a feminine way associated with the moon goddess or Ashra, which I refer to as plan A, and a masculine way associated with the sun god or Baal that I refer to as plan B. But both techniques are aiming for the same satanic end, which is control or domination. Now, up until this stage of human history, Satan had always managed to get his way with plan A, subtle manipulation. He appealed to the pride of the angels, and a third followed him. He appealed to the pride of Adam and Eve, and the same thing happened. After the flood, he managed to influence Nimrod and Semiramis, and satanic polytheism began filling the earth. He must have felt pretty pleased with himself, because in the time period between Adam and Moses, human beings had actually been very easy pickings for him. He'd been able to sway pretty much whoever he wanted, whenever he wanted, without much resistance at all. He never had to go to war against humans in an overt sense. He'd merely appealed to their vanity and offered them the world. In the face of that offer, they had buckled every time. Some more examples of this. When the Muslim prophet Muhammad first established Islam, his initial approach to the Jews was the same. Muhammad tried to be subtle about introducing his false religion into their midst. He claimed he served the same God as them and was a prophet. This was plan A. When the Jews rejected his claims, he turned violent against them and was hell-bent on their destruction for the rest of his days, and this was plan B. When Jesus was in the wilderness prior to the commencement of his ministry, Satan tempted him with plan A. He promised him land, wealth, and status. When Jesus turned him down, Satan saw to it that he was crucified. This was plan B. When Edmund finds himself in Narnia in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, the White Witch is charming and polite, offering him Turkish delight and hot chocolate. This is plan A. When Edmund comes to his senses, she goes after him, demanding his life, and she would have had it too if Aslan had not ransomed it. This was plan B. Plan A is manipulation, and plan B is intimidation. These are the two ways for Satan to reach the same target, domination. He wants to dominate the earth. Now, up until this stage, Satan had gone with plan A as far as the Jews were concerned. He thought they could be swayed and tempted to follow him like the rest of the world if he pitched it just right. He was wrong. It had won him some battles, but it just wasn't winning him the war. God was determined enough to keep restoring them to him, to keep drawing them back into him, and to keep forgiving them, no matter how many times they strayed. And so Satan has regularly switched to plan B. Across the world and throughout history, the Jews have frequently been threatened with extermination, enslavement, and persecution. Hatred of the Jews in nations, organizations, and individuals is often a telltale sign of Satan's influence behind the scenes. Immediately after Israel was established in the promised land of Canaan, it was governed by a system of judges, and God was considered to be their supreme ruler or king. But by the time of 1 Samuel, the people started to demand a human king in order to be like the other nations around them. In spite of God's warnings about this, they persisted with the request, and God obliged. The first human king was Saul, who was soon replaced by David, and this takes us into the book of 1 Kings in the Bible, where the subsequent succession of kings are documented. These transitions of leadership led to a downward spiral and the eventual division of Israel, and throughout it all we see a constant invasion of Baal worship over the years. Satan was still going with plan A at this point. The pivotal figure was King Ahab, and just as Nimrod's importance was hinted at by the extra attention given to him in Genesis, the same can be said of King Ahab in the book of 1 Kings. The writer makes sure to elaborate on his reign and to tell us his story in greater depth than the other kings. The Bible says of Ahab that he did evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. This guy was the worst of the worst. There had been bad kings before, but no one touched Ahab. Not only this, but he married a woman called Jezebel, who was the princess daughter of Ethbaal, Canaanite king of Tyre and Sidon, and priest of Astarte. You couldn't get a worse combination of titles, and clearly this was not the kind of family the king of Israel should have been marrying into. For a people that God was intent on keeping undefiled and pure, this marriage would pose significant problems. As expected, soon after their marriage, the pollution began. Ahab established a temple for Baal and an Asherah pole in Israel for his wife's sake. An Asherah pole is basically an obscene phallic symbol, otherwise known as an obelisk. But Queen Jezebel was not content to simply allow the worship of Baal and Asherah concurrently with the worship of Israel's true God. She was determined to eliminate worship of the true God altogether. She embarked on a campaign whereby most of God's prophets were killed, and in their place were installed false prophets for Baal and Asherah. She successfully controlled Ahab, implemented idol worship, and had him build a temple in their honor. As a result, the biblical record shows Israel plunging from the heights of David's glorious and godly reign to the depths of the pagan idolatry and Satanism under Ahab, and this was in many ways Israel's darkest hour. Satan was very close to winning God's chosen people to himself, once and for all. The apostasy of Israel was almost complete. The foundations of godliness were fast crumbling. The judgment of God was forthcoming. Now, do Ahab and Jezebel remind you of anyone? They were virtually identical to Nimrod and Semiramis. It's almost as though Satan thought to himself that since this tactic had worked so well in Babylon, it might just be the one that would finally clinch victory in the battle to subvert the Israelites. Like when a play or shot works particularly well in sports, you're tempted to use it again in the hope it produces the same result. This is what he was doing. He was attempting to create the same kind of structure within Israel that he had created in Babylon and was hoping the same end would be achieved. Just as Semiramis had risen to power on the coattails of Nimrod, the evil Jezebel wed herself to Ahab and introduced idolatry into their life as an evil religious practice. This was probably not a marriage of love. Rather, it was a spiritual and political affiliation designed to merge two different kingdoms. Just as Semiramis had an insatiable lust for power and would go to any ends to retain it, even killing her husband and plotting to kill her son, we see the same kind of spirit in Jezebel, a lust for power, control, and domination. Given her background in Baal worship where sex acts and licentious living was exalted as a way to tap into the power of the gods, she would have had no qualms about sleeping her way to the top. Ahab, king of Israel, was completely subdued and dominated by Jezebel. Israel was now full of pagan shrines, filled with priestess prostitutes, servicing the worshippers. The sexual lure was more than the men of Israel could resist. By Jezebel's influence, 10 million Israelites left the worship of God for Baal and Ashtoreth. Only 7,000 people in the entire nation were not swayed by her control. This is how close Satan came to claiming Israel and thus removing the last remaining barrier between him and world domination. God, however, as always, had a man for the job, Elijah. Jezebel had killed most of God's prophets but hadn't managed to get her hands on Elijah yet, and it was he who God used to turn Israel back from the brink. It all took place on Mount Carmel, a direct showdown between God and Baal. Elijah was becoming exasperated with the disobedience of the Jews and their constant wandering away from God. The nation that God had reserved for himself by covenant kept prostituting itself with the evil Babylonian system, and so he challenged the priests of Baal to go to Mount Carmel for a contest in front of all Israel. Notice again how he chooses a mountain for this confrontation. They are competing to find out who is the commander of the high places and the real Most High God. The confrontation is designed to show God's people once and for all that they should turn their back on Baal, who is Satan, and commit themselves to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, "How much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, then follow him." But the people were completely silent. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Now bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish, and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call in the name of your God, and I will call in the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God." And all the people agreed. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "You go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it and call in the name of your God, but do not set fire to the wood." So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called in the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, "O Baal, answer us!" But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. "You'll have to shout louder," he scoffed, "for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming or is relieving himself, or maybe he is away on a trip or is asleep and needs to be wakened." So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, but still there was no sound, no reply, no response. Then Elijah called to the people, "Come over here." They all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel, and he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wood. Then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour the water over the offering and the wood." After they had done this, he said, "Do the same thing again." And when they were finished, he said, "Now do it a 3rd time." So they did as he said, and the water ran around the altar and even filled the trench. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me. Answer me so that these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have brought them back to yourself." Immediately the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell down on the ground and cried out, "The Lord, He is God. Yes, the Lord is God." Then Elijah commanded, "Seize all the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one escape." So the people seized them all, and Elijah took them down to the Kishon Valley and killed them there. Notice that self-mutilation was a part of the normal custom for Baal worship, and remember that Satan loves to humiliate and mutilate man because he is made in God's image. One of the evidences of the increasing influence on paganism on society today as we hurtle towards the New World Order, the Antichrist, and the end times is the rise in self-harm, tattooing, and unusual piercings. Particularly tattoos have become socially acceptable, and Christians have fallen prey to this pollution. Here are some quotations from various experts regarding the practice.